The shield Marcus Chun adjusted his formal diplomatic robes, the unfamiliar weight of the ceremonial sash pressing against his chest. The crystalline halls of the Zephyrian imperial palace stretched endlessly in all directions, their surfaces reflecting light in patterns that seemed to shift and dance with each step. Around him, hundreds of alien dignitaries maintained their species' characteristic composure, but Marcus could feel their collective disdain like a physical weight. Zephyrians were a proud people, their silver-blue skin marked with luminescent patterns that indicated rank and lineage. They had conquered half the galaxy through superior technology and unwavering logic, viewing other species as either useful tools or obstacles to be removed. Humans, with their unpredictable emotions and chaotic tendencies, fell firmly into the latter category. "Behold," announced Chancellor Veximer, his voice carrying the authority of centuries, the human representative. The elderly Zephyrian's head crest flared slightly, a subtle display of contempt. A cultural liaison from the primitive world of Earth, here to observe our grand assembly. Marcus had studied their language for months, but the subtle harmonics that conveyed their true feelings were unmistakable. To them, he was little more than a curiosity, a reminder of how far evolution could fall short of Zephyrian perfection. The great doors at the far end of the hall began to open with mechanical precision, and Princess Lyra Vexthara entered like a force of nature contained within elegant form. Her silver-blue skin seemed to glow from within, and the luminescent patterns across her temples and neck pulsed with a gentle rhythm that indicated both nobility and immense power. She moved with fluid grace, each step calculated and purposeful. Her elongated limbs carrying her with an almost ethereal quality. Her eyes, a striking shade of violet that seemed to hold depths of ancient wisdom, swept across the assembled crowd before settling briefly on Marcus. For a moment, something flickered in those depths. Curiosity, perhaps, or mild interest. Then her expression returned to the mask of untouchable authority that her people expected. "Your Highness," Chancellor Veximer continued, bowing precisely. 15 degrees. As tradition demands, we present the gathered representatives of the Empire's allied worlds. Though I confess, some selections remain unconventional. Marcus felt the weight of 1,000 years of Zephyrian superiority pressing down on him. These beings had mastered faster than light travel, while humans were still discovering fire. They had built an empire spanning hundreds of worlds through pure logic and technological supremacy. To them, humanity's emotional nature was a primitive flaw, a weakness to be pitied at best. "The human will observe adequately," Princess Lyra replied, her voice carrying the musical cadence of her people while remaining utterly neutral. Different perspectives, while often illogical, can sometimes provide unexpected insights. The ceremony began with the traditional recitation of the Empire's achievements, a carefully choreographed display of power that would formally recognize the loyalty of all allied worlds. Marcus took his assigned position near the back of the hall, close enough to observe but far enough to emphasize his status as an outsider. The palace's main chamber was filled with representatives from across the galaxy. Tall, insectoid Thrakani. Delegates clicked their mandibles in rhythmic approval. The gaseous Nihilords floated in their containment suits, their forms shifting like living clouds. Dozens of other species, all conquered and integrated into the Zephyrian Empire, all maintaining the respectful silence demanded by protocol. But Marcus's human intuition detected something else beneath the surface. Tension, unrest, the kind of dangerous undercurrent that his people would have recognized immediately, but that Zephyrian logic might dismiss as irrelevant statistical variance. As Princess Lyra moved to the ceremonial dais for the final address, Marcus's peripheral vision caught a flicker of movement in the upper galleries. His training kicked in, not the diplomatic education he'd received for this posting, but the military experience that his civilian credentials conveniently omitted. Time seemed to slow as he processed the threat. 3 figures in dark, form-fitting suits had emerged from concealment behind decorative columns. The weapons in their hands weren't Zephyrian technology, but something more primitive and infinitely more deadly. Korathian plasma rifles, designed to pierce through energy shields and armor with devastating effect. The assassins moved with practiced coordination, their weapons trained on Princess Lyra's exposed position. Marcus counted the shots they were, preparing to fire. 6 plasma bolts, each glowing with the sickly green light of compressed energy. They were aimed directly at the princess's vital organs, positioned to ensure maximum damage. Logic dictated that Marcus should shout a warning, perhaps alert the palace guards, maybe even throw himself to the side to avoid becoming collateral damage. But Marcus didn't operate on Zephyrian logic. He operated on human instinct, on the emotional imperative that his people called courage and the Zephyrians called madness. Without thought, without calculation, without considering the consequences or the impossibility of success, Marcus sprinted forward. His legs carried him across the polished floor, faster than he'd ever moved before, adrenaline flooding his system as he closed the distance between himself and the princess. The first plasma bolt discharged, just as Marcus reached her. Position. He slammed into Princess Lyra, driving her to the ground as the superheated energy seared through the air where she had been standing. The second and third bolts found their mark, striking Marcus in the shoulder and chest as he shielded her with his own body. Fire erupted across his torso as the plasma energy burned through his ceremonial robes and into his flesh. The fourth bolt caught him in the side, spinning him around as he fought to maintain his protective position over the princess. The fifth and sixth shots struck his back and leg, the impact driving him to his knees. But his last coherent thought, as consciousness began to fade and his vision darkened around the edges, was simple and entirely human. She was safe. He had succeeded. The princess would live. A ceremonial hall erupted into chaos as the human diplomat collapsed, smoke rising from his wounds. Palace guards swarmed the gallery, quickly subduing the Korathian assassins, but the damage was done. Marcus lay motionless on the crystalline floor, his blood forming stark patterns against the reflective surface. Princess Lyra knelt beside his fallen form, her composed mask cracking for the first time in her life. She had never seen such a display of selfless courage, such a complete disregard for personal safety in service of another's protection. Her people prized logical self-preservation above all else. What Marcus had done was not just brave. It was incomprehensible. "Medical team to the Grand Assembly," she called, her voice carrying an urgency that surprised even her. "Priority emergency protocols." Now the palace's advanced medical systems responded immediately, but as the emergency team worked to stabilize Marcus's condition, Princess Lyra found herself studying his unconscious face. The plasma burns were severe, the energy having seared through multiple layers of tissue, but somehow he still breathed. Somehow, impossibly, he had survived impacts that should have killed him instantly. "Your Highness," the lead medic reported, his voice filled with professional confusion. "The human's biological responses are unusual. The plasma energy should have been fatal, but his body seems to be adapting to the damage in ways we don't understand." Hours passed as Marcus fought for life in the palace's medical facility. Zephyrian physicians, masters of biological science, found themselves baffled by human physiology. His heart rate, blood pressure, and neural activity all fluctuated in patterns that defied their understanding. When pain should have overwhelmed his system, his body produced natural chemicals that provided relief. When tissue damage should have been irreversible, his cells began regenerating at an accelerated rate. "It's as if," the chief physician explained, to Princess Lyra, his emotional state is directly affecting his physical recovery. The determination to survive, the drive to protect others, It's somehow enhancing his natural healing abilities. Princess Lyra maintained her vigil beside Marcus's bed, watching the strange human who had sacrificed himself for her safety. She had studied human culture as part of her diplomatic training, but she had never truly understood the emotional bonds that drove their behavior. Now, witnessing the results of such selfless action, she found herself questioning everything. She had been taught about the superiority of pure logic. When Marcus finally opened his eyes 3 days later, the first thing he saw was Princess Lyra's face. Her violet eyes filled with something he had never expected to see from a Zephyrian. Genuine concern. "You're awake," she said, and her voice carried a tremor that protocol would never have allowed. "The physician said you might not survive. The plasma burns were too severe, the damage too extensive." Marcus tried to sit up, immediately regretting the decision as pain lanced through his shoulder and chest. "The assassins," he managed to say, his voice rough from days of unconsciousness. "Did they escape?" "Captured," Princess Lyra replied, her expression darkening. "Interrogated. They were Corinthian agents sent to destabilize the Empire by eliminating the royal line. They're being held in the maximum security detention center." The response: the emergency session of the Zephyrian High Council convened within hours of Marcus's recovery. The crystalline chamber filled with the Empire's most powerful leaders. Princess Lyra entered with the measured grace expected of royalty. But those who knew her well could detect the subtle changes in her bearing. Her luminescent patterns pulsed with a different rhythm. Her violet eyes held a new intensity, and her movements carried a barely contained energy that spoke of fundamental transformation. Chancellor Veximer stood at the head of the curved council table, his head crest flared in disapproval. "Your Highness," he began, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of tradition, "we must address the unprecedented situation created by the human's actions." "Indeed we must," Princess Lyra replied, her tone carefully controlled. "Marcus Chun saved my life at the cost of his own well-being. Such courage deserves recognition, not criticism." "Courage?" Councillor Vexra, the Minister of Cultural Affairs, interjected. "The human's behavior was irrational, unpredictable, and contrary to all logical self-preservation. Such emotional responses cannot be encouraged or rewarded." "His emotional response," Princess Lyra said, her voice gaining strength, "preserved the royal line and prevented a diplomatic catastrophe. His irrationality, as you call it, succeeded where our logical security protocols failed." The council chamber fell silent. In the 1,000-year history of the Zephyrian Empire, no member of the royal family had ever spoken so directly in defense of alien behavior, especially human behavior. "Your Highness," Chancellor Veximer said carefully, "surely you cannot mean to suggest that human emotional instability is superior to Zephyrian logic." "I suggest," Princess Lyra replied, rising from her seat, "that we have much to learn from a species capable of such selfless sacrifice. I invoke the ancient law of Kethmara, the life debt that binds protector to protected until the debt is repaid." The reaction was immediate and unprecedented. Counselors who had maintained perfect composure for decades showed visible signs of shock. The law of Kethmara hadn't been invoked in over 500 years, and never for an alien. "Your Highness," Counselor Zeflak, the elderly Minister of Law, spoke with trembling voice. "The Kethmara was designed for Zephyrian warriors, not primitive aliens. Surely you cannot mean to bind yourself to a human. The law makes no distinction." "Based on species," Princess Lyra replied, her knowledge of ancient statutes surprising even the legal experts. "Marcus Chun risked his life to preserve mine. By the oldest traditions of our people, he has earned the right to protection, honor, and consideration." "This is madness," Chancellor Veximer declared, his usual composure cracking. "The human has clearly influenced your judgment through some form of emotional manipulation. We cannot allow the royal line to be compromised by primitive alien psychology. The human, Princess Lyra said, her voice carrying a dangerous edge, has a name. Marcus Chun, and he has shown more honor in 3 days than some members of this council had displayed in decades. The accusation hung in the air like a weapon. Several councilors exchanged glances, recognizing the implicit challenge to their authority and competence. Your Highness, Councilor Thexra said, attempting to restore order, perhaps we should consider the broader implications of such unprecedented actions. The other allied worlds will interpret this as weakness, as capitulation to inferior species. Let them, Princess Lyra replied, moving to the great window that overlooked the capital city. For too long, we have ruled through fear and superiority. Perhaps it's time we learn to rule through respect and understanding. The council session dissolved into chaos as the implications of her words sank in. Princess Lyra was proposing nothing less than a fundamental restructuring of the empire's relationship with its subject species. The Zephyrian way of life, built on logical superiority and emotional suppression, was being challenged by a human's simple act of courage. Marcus's recovery progressed rapidly over the following days, aided by both advanced Zephyrian medical technology and what the physicians were beginning to recognize as remarkable human resilience. Princess Lyra visited him daily, officially to monitor his progress, but increasingly to engage in conversations that challenged everything she had been taught about governance and leadership. Your people, she said one afternoon as they sat in the medical facility's garden, they form bonds that transcend logic. How do you maintain order without strict hierarchical control? Marcus considered the question, watching alien flowers bloom in patterns that defied earthly botany. We don't always maintain order, he admitted. We argue, we fight, we make mistakes. But we also protect each other, sacrifice for each other, and work together when it matters most. Such chaos should lead to societal collapse, Princess Lyra observed, though her tone suggested genuine curiosity rather than criticism. It sometimes does, Marcus replied. But it also leads to innovation, creativity, and strength that comes from diversity rather than uniformity. When everyone thinks the same way, you miss opportunities and dangers that different perspectives might catch. As you caught the assassins that our security protocols missed, she said quietly. Your people are incredibly intelligent, Marcus said, careful not to sound condescending. But intelligence and wisdom aren't the same thing. Sometimes the heart sees what the mind cannot. Their conversations were interrupted by the arrival of urgent news. The Korathian Syndicate, the criminal organization behind the assassination attempt, had launched a full-scale attack on the Empire's border worlds. 3 systems had already fallen, and their forces were advancing toward the core territories, with technology that seemed to counter Zephyrian defenses. They're using some kind of adaptive shielding, General Kekstar reported to the emergency council session. Our weapons are having minimal effect, and their battle tactics are unlike anything we've encountered. Impossible, Chancellor Veximer declared. The Korathians are a minor criminal syndicate. They lack the resources and technology for such an assault. Unless they've received support from another power, Princess Lyra said, her mind already working through the implications. Or unless they've developed new strategies that our traditional approaches cannot counter. Marcus, despite his injuries, had been granted permission to attend the council session. His unique perspective as both an outsider and a military specialist might provide insights that pure Zephyrian logic could not. May I see the battle reports? He asked, his voice still weak but determined. The human has no military authority, Councillor Thexra objected. This is a matter of imperial security. The human has a name, Princess Lyra said firmly, and his tactical insights might prove valuable. Show him the reports. Marcus studied the holographic displays with growing understanding. The Korathian tactics weren't random or chaotic as they appeared. They were deliberately unpredictable, using emotional and psychological warfare to disrupt the logical response patterns that Zephyrian forces had been trained to follow. "They're not trying to defeat your military," he said finally. "They're trying to confuse it. Your forces are trained to respond to logical threats with logical countermeasures. But the Korathians are using chaos as a weapon." "Explain," Princess Lyra commanded. "Look at their attack patterns," Marcus said, highlighting sections of them. "Display. They're not targeting your strongest defenses or your most strategic positions. They're hitting emotional targets, civilian populations, cultural sites. They're trying to provoke an emotional response that will override your logical decision-making. And that's effective?" General Kexthar asked, his professional interest overriding his skepticism. "Against a species that suppresses emotion, yes," Marcus replied. "Your people aren't trained to handle chaos and unpredictability, but humans are. We thrive in chaotic situations because we use intuition and emotional intelligence to fill the gaps that logic can't reach." "You're suggesting we adopt human military tactics?" Chancellor Vexmer's voice dripped with disdain. "I'm suggesting we combine human adaptability with Zephyrian technology," Marcus replied. "Your weapons and shields are superior to anything the Korathians have. But your tactical flexibility is limited by your reliance on predictable patterns." Princess Lyra leaned forward, her violet eyes intense with consideration. "What do you propose?" "Mixed units," Marcus said. "Human tactical advisors working with Zephyrian commanders. Your people provide the technology and strategic planning, while humans provide the adaptability and unpredictability needed to counter Korathian chaos tactics." The council chamber erupted in protests. The idea of humans commanding Zephyrian forces was not just unprecedented. It was heretical. But Princess Lyra raised her hand for silence. "We will implement the human suggestion," she declared. "Immediately." "Your Highness," Chancellor Vexmer said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger, "this is madness. You cannot place the Empire's security in the hands of primitive aliens." "I place it in the hands of those who have proven their worth," Princess Lyra replied. "Marcus Chun has already demonstrated his willingness to sacrifice for the Empire's protection. If his tactical insights can save Zephyrian lives, then we will use them." The battle for the Kethmori system began 3 days later. Princess Lyra insisted on leading the fleet personally, with Marcus serving as her tactical advisor despite his injuries. The Korathian forces had established a strong defensive position around the system's primary planet, using their adaptive shielding to neutralize the Zephyrian fleet's initial assault. "They're using the same pattern," Marcus observed, studying the enemy formations. "Organized chaos designed to confuse your targeting systems. But chaos has its own logic if you know how to read it." "Show me," Princess Lyra commanded. Marcus began issuing orders that seemed to make no sense to the Zephyrian crew. Instead of the precise formations they were accustomed to, he ordered ships to move in seemingly random patterns. Instead of coordinated strikes, he called for individual vessels to engage targets based on opportunity rather than strategy. "This is madness," General Kexthar muttered, but he followed the orders. The result was immediate and devastating. The Korathian adaptive systems, designed to counter logical attack patterns, couldn't cope with the apparent randomness of human-influenced tactics. What looked like chaos to Zephyrian eyes was actually sophisticated pattern recognition, using intuition and emotional intelligence to predict enemy behavior. "How did you know?" Princess Lyra asked as the Korathian fleet began to break apart. "Under the assault." "Because I understand chaos," Marcus replied. "Your people see it as the absence of order, but humans see it as a different kind of order. One that follows emotional and psychological patterns rather than logical ones." The victory at Kethmori was decisive, but its implications reached far beyond military success. Word spread throughout the empire that human tactical advice had saved Zephyrian lives, that emotional intelligence had succeeded where pure logic had failed. The rigid hierarchies that had defined the empire for millennia began to crack under the weight of this new understanding. Princess Lyra's transformation was complete. She had entered the medical facility as a traditional Zephyrian ruler, believing in the superiority of logic and order. She emerged as something unprecedented, a leader who understood that true strength came from embracing diversity rather than suppressing it. The Human Council proposal, she announced to the assembled government, will be implemented immediately. Representatives from all allied species will be granted full voting rights in imperial governance. We will learn from each other rather than simply ruling over each other. The changes that followed were swift and profound. Human advisors were integrated into military and civilian leadership roles. Emotional intelligence training became mandatory for all government officials. The empire's relationship with its subject species shifted from domination to partnership. But the most significant change was in Princess Lyra herself, the woman who had once prized logical detachment above all, else now spoke passionately about the value of diverse perspectives. The ruler who had seen emotions as weakness now understood them as a different kind of strength. "You've transformed an empire," Marcus said during one of their private conversations, months after the battle. "You transformed me first, Princess." Lyra replied, her luminescent patterns pulsing with what Marcus had learned was the Zephyrian equivalent of deep affection. "When you threw yourself between me and those plasma bolts, you didn't just save my life. You showed me that there are things worth sacrificing for, things that matter more than logical self-preservation. And what have you learned?" Marcus asked. "That courage isn't the absence of fear," Princess Lyra said, her violet eyes meeting his. "It's the willingness to act despite fear. That strength isn't the suppression of emotion, but the wisdom to use emotion appropriately. That true. Leadership isn't about being superior to others, but about helping others become their best selves." The Zephyrian Empire that emerged from this transformation was fundamentally different from the one that had existed before. No longer a rigid hierarchy based on logical superiority, it became a confederation of diverse species working together for mutual benefit. The changes weren't always smooth, and there were those who resisted the new order, but the results spoke for themselves. Trade flourished as different species contributed their unique strengths. Scientific advancement accelerated as emotional intuition complemented logical analysis. Military effectiveness improved as tactical flexibility replaced rigid doctrine. The empire became stronger, more adaptable, and more resilient than it had ever been under pure Zephyrian rule. Marcus Chun, the human who had taken the arrows meant for a princess, became something unprecedented in galactic history. A bridge between species, a living symbol of the strength that came from unity rather than dominance. His simple act of courage had rippled outward, transforming not just an individual or a government, but an entire civilization's understanding of what it meant to be strong. Princess Lyra, now Empress Lyra Vexthara, ruled over an empire that had learned to embrace the very qualities it had once scorned. Emotion, intuition, sacrifice, and love were no longer seen as weaknesses to be suppressed, but as strengths to be cultivated and honored. And in the crystalline halls of the imperial palace, where once only the cold light of logic had shone, the warm glow of understanding illuminated a future where humans and aliens stood together as equals, united by the recognition that true strength came not from what divided them, but from what they shared. The human had shielded her with his life, and her response had shaken the very foundations of the galaxy.